The Finalization of a Dream, Habitat 67, 1972. Chapter 1, The Post-Expo Crisis, 1967 to 1968. Welcome to Synapse Daily. Today, we stand on the year 1972. But to understand the end, we must see the wreckage of the beginning. Imagine the scene in late 1967. The party of the century was over. Expo 67 had been a massive success for Montreal. Millions of people had walked through the Man and His World exhibition. But now, the lights were dimming. The vibrant pavilions were being disassembled. The futuristic monorail had stopped humming. On the Site du Havre, Habitat 67 stood like a lonely gray mountain. It was a strange time. The world was moving on. People were looking toward the 1970s. Many saw Habitat 67 as a leftover prop. They saw it as a temporary stage for the fair. In the halls of the Canadian government, a dark debate began. What do we do with this concrete pile? It was expensive to keep. It was built with taxpayer money. It was an experimental prototype. Some politicians wanted to tear it down. They called it a monument to waste. They argued that the experiment was over. They said the data had been collected. Now, it was time to clear the land. But there was a problem. People were already living there. Moshe Safdie was not done with his vision. The early residents were not just tenants. They were pioneers. They were living in a building that the world thought was a ghost. This was the survival phase. The building had no supermarket nearby. It had no proper transit after the Expo closed. It was isolated on a pier in the middle of the river. The wind from the St. Lawrence was brutal. It whipped against the raw concrete walls. During 1968, the residents formed a tight community. They had to prove the building was viable. They had to show it was a neighborhood, not just an exhibit. Safdie himself moved into the complex. He wanted to feel the flaws of his own creation. He wanted to hear the wind. He wanted to see how the light hit the boxes in February. This wasn't about architecture anymore. It was about human stubbornness. They were fighting against the temporary label. They were fighting for the right to exist. This period was the true birth of the Habitat spirit. It was the moment the concrete stopped being a project and started being a home. 1968 was a year of transition and fear. The dream was under siege by reality. Every day the building stood was a victory. Every child playing on the skywalks was a protest. They were proving that the future could not be easily demolished. Chapter 2, The Debugging of a Masterpiece, 1969 to 1970. Architecture is perfect on paper. It is beautiful in a model. But in 1969, Habitat 67 faced the ultimate judge, the Canadian winter. This was the era of debugging. If you have ever bought a prototype car, you know the feeling. Everything is new. Everything is untested. And everything eventually breaks. The modular construction was a revolution. But 354 concrete boxes create thousands of joints. In 1969, those joints began to speak. The rain was the first enemy. Water is a patient thief. It finds the smallest gap in the seal. It enters the concrete. It freezes and expands. In the early years, leaks were common. Imagine living in a masterpiece and having to put a bucket in your living room. The engineers had to return to the site. They were not there to build. They were there to fix. This was the invisible construction. They crawled into the narrow gaps between the boxes. They applied new types of sealants. They experimented with high-tech membranes. Then, there was the sound. Concrete is a great conductor of vibration. In the early design, the boxes were supposed to be independent. But they were held together by high-tension cables. In 1970, residents complained about noise. You could hear a neighbor's footsteps echoing through the structure. The vertical village was a bit too social. The engineers had to rethink the insulation. They had to dampen the vibrations without ruining the aesthetics. This was a war of centimeters. The most complex issue was the thermal bridge. Since each box was exposed to the air on all sides, the cold was everywhere. The heating bills were astronomical. The building was literally bleeding energy. Safdie and his team had to invent ways to insulate the raw look of the concrete. They didn't want to cover the building in siding. That would destroy the veteran brute soul. So, they worked from the inside. They used new sprays. They used thicker panels. This period was the most important for the 1972 finalization. Without the lessons of 1969 and 1970, Habitat 67 would have failed. It would have become a crumbling ruin within a decade. Instead, it became a laboratory. The workers on site were like doctors. They were treating a patient that was still growing. They were refining the plug-in concept in real time. By the end of 1970, the building was stronger. It was drier. It was quieter. It was becoming a permanent fortress of urbanism. The debugging phase turned a student's dream into a professional's reality. It was a messy, expensive, and difficult process. But it was the only way to save the future. Chapter 3, the 1972 Finalization, the official stamp. By the time 1972 arrived, the atmosphere had changed. The doubt was fading. The government had finally accepted that Habitat 67 was here to stay. 1972 was the year of the official finalization. This wasn't just a date on a calendar. It was a legal and structural milestone. This was the year the building was officially handed over as a completed residential complex. The last of the Expo-era temporary structures were removed. The landscaping was finally finished. Think about the visual change in 1972. For 5 years, the site had looked like a construction zone. There were trailers. There were piles of dirt. There were unfinished walkways. In 1972, the dust settled. The gardens were the key. Safdie's slogan was "For everyone, a garden." In 1967, those gardens were just dirt and small twigs. By 1972, the trees had taken root. Ivy was beginning to climb the gray concrete. The mountain was turning green. This was the visual proof of Safdie's thesis. The geometry was no longer harsh. It was softened by life. The year 1972 also marked the final tensioning of the structural cables. The building was a post-tensioned marvel. This means the boxes were not just stacked, they were pulled together by massive steel guts. In 1972, the engineers did their final checks. They ensured the 90-ton cubes were perfectly balanced. The vertical village was now a single, solid unit. It was rock solid. Politically, 1972 was the year of validation. Architecture critics from around the world returned to Montreal. They wanted to see if the boy wonder Safdie had failed. What they found was a thriving community. The 158 units were full. People were waiting in line to get in. The failed experiment was now the most desirable address in the city. The finalization was a slap in the face to the skeptics. It proved that radical could also be reliable. The government issued the final permits. The construction bonds were closed. The 1972 finalization was the moment the building stopped being an event and became a landmark. It was now part of the Montreal skyline forever. It was no longer a guest, it was the host. This was the year the concrete was officially set in history. It was a moment of deep pride for the residents. They had survived the leaks. They had survived the cold. They had survived the politicians. In 1972, they were finally home. Chapter 4, The Economic Sacrifice, Why It Stopped at 158. Every story of victory has a shadow. For Habitat 67, the shadow fell in 1972. We must talk about the economic sacrifice. Moshe Safdie's original dream was not a single building. It was a system. His thesis showed a massive complex of 1,200 units. It was supposed to stretch across the river. It was supposed to be a city of the future. But in 1972, that dream was officially truncated. The finalization meant the end of growth. Why? Because the numbers were terrifying. Each box in Habitat 67 was a custom engineering feat. The idea of mass production had hit a wall. In a factory, you make the same thing a million times to save money. But Safdie's fractal chaos meant every box needed unique placement and tensioning. 1972 was the year the government looked at the ledger. They realized they had spent millions on 158 homes. For that same money, they could have built thousands of traditional apartments. The social utopia dream was dying. Safdie wanted this to be housing for the people. He wanted it to be affordable. But by 1972, it was clear that only the elite could afford to maintain it. The cost of heating, the cost of the specialized elevators, and the cost of the gardens were too high for the average worker. The 1972 finalization was a golden cage. The building was a masterpiece, but it was too expensive to replicate. This created a major conflict. Safdie was heartbroken. He saw his universal solution becoming a luxury boutique. In 1972, the modular factory on the site was finally dismantled. The steel molds were sold for scrap. The massive cranes were moved to build traditional, oaring skyscrapers downtown. This was the moment the world decided that Habitat was an exception, not the rule. We have to ask, was it a failure because it didn't scale? Or was it a success because it existed at all? By 1972, the economic sacrifice was complete. The building was frozen in time. No more boxes would ever be added. The 158 units became a closed circle. This made the property values skyrocket. It turned a social experiment into a museum of wealth. This shift in 1972 changed the DNA of the project forever. It became a monument to a future that the world couldn't afford to build. It remains a beautiful, tragic reminder of what happens when art outruns the economy. Chapter 5: The Microarchitecture of 1972, Space Age Interiors. By 1972, the interior of Habitat 67 had become as famous as its exterior. Stepping inside a unit was like entering a vision of the year 2000. While the outside was rugged and gray, the inside was smooth, white, and futuristic. This was the space age era of design. Everything was about efficiency. Safdie wanted to prove that a small space could feel like a mansion. The highlight of the 1972 interior was the modular bathroom. These were not built by plumbers on site. They were single pieces of molded fiberglass. They looked like something from a NASA capsule. The sink, the tub, and the walls were all one seamless unit. This meant there were no cracks for mold to grow. It was easy to clean. It was hygienic. It was high-tech. In 1972, these bathrooms were a sensation. They represented the dream of industrializing the home. Then, there were the kitchens. Safdie worked with top designers to create Frigidaire kitchens. They were built into the walls. There were no wasted gaps between the stove and the counter. Every centimeter was calculated. The windows were another marvel. Because the boxes were staggered, most units had windows on 3 sides. This was unheard of in 1970s apartment living. In a normal building, you have windows on one side and a dark hallway on the other. In Habitat, you were surrounded by light. By the 1972 finalization, 15 different unit types had been established. Some were small, 1-box studios. Others were massive, 3-box houses with internal staircases. This variety was crucial. It meant the building didn't feel like a barracks. It felt like a collection of unique homes. The flooring was often made of warm wood to contrast the cold concrete. The heating was hidden in the baseboards. Residents in 1972 felt like they were living in a luxury yacht in the sky. The furniture was often minimalist. People didn't want to clutter the clean lines of the boxes. This was the birth of the less is more lifestyle in Canada. The micro-architecture of 1972 showed that luxury wasn't about gold or marble. It was about light, air, and smart geometry. It proved that the industrial home could be beautiful. It was a masterpiece of ergonomics. Chapter 6: The Salt and the Stone, the War of Durability. If concrete is the stone of the modern age, then salt is its poison. As Habitat 67 was finalized in 1972, a silent war was beginning. This was the war against chemistry. Montreal is a city that fights winter with salt. Millions of tons of salt are spread on the roads and walkways every year. For a concrete building, this is a death sentence. The 1972 finalization required a specialized maintenance plan. The engineers realized that salt water was seeping into the porous concrete. When salt reaches the internal steel reinforcements, it causes them to rust. Rust expands. When it expands, it cracks the concrete from the inside out. This is called spalling. By 1972, the first signs of this were appearing on the streets in the sky. The maintenance teams had to become innovators. They began testing new types of waterproof membranes. They had to coat the walkways with specialized resins. This wasn't just a cleaning job. It was a structural defense. They had to ensure that the raw look of the Béton brut was preserved while being protected. They couldn't just paint over it. That would destroy the architectural integrity. There was also the issue of the freeze-thaw cycle. Montreal can be 5 degrees and raining in the morning and minus 20 degrees by night. Water gets into the concrete pores, freezes, and breaks the stone. In 1972, the final seals were applied to the most exposed corners of the boxes. The building was essentially shrink-wrapped with invisible chemicals. This technical struggle is why the building still stands today. Many other brutalist buildings from the 1960s were torn down because they crumbled. Habitat 67 survived because the 1972 finalization included a commitment to high-tech preservation. The stone was strong, but the salt was persistent. The battle for the surface of Habitat 67 became a blueprint for how to save concrete landmarks all over the world. It showed that brutalism requires eternal vigilance. Chapter 7: Social Dynamics of the Skystreets, the Vertical Village. What happens to a community when you move their sidewalks 10 stories into the air? By 1972, we had the answer. Habitat 67 had become a vertical village. The streets in the sky were finalized and fully operational. These were the open-air walkways that connected the clusters of boxes. They were the heart of the building's social life. In a traditional apartment, the hallway is a place of transition. You walk fast. You look down. You don't talk to neighbors. In Habitat 67, the streets were wide. They were exposed to the fresh air and the views of the river. This changed how people behaved. In 1972, residents reported a sense of forced serendipity. You would run into your neighbor while looking at the sunset. You would stop to talk about the wind. The children of 1972 had a unique childhood. They played on these elevated streets. They rode bikes hundreds of feet above the ground, protected by high glass railings. There were no cars. It was the safest street in Montreal. This was Safdie's dream realized. He wanted to recreate the safety of a small village in a dense city. The gardens also played a social role. Because your neighbor's roof was your terrace, there was a shared sense of space. You could see your neighbor gardening below you. You could wave from your balcony. It was a design that broke the loneliness of the city. By the time the project was finalized in 1972, a powerful tenant association had formed. They didn't just share a building, they shared a vision. Critics in the late 60s said people would feel dizzy or exposed. They said the wind would make the walkways unusable. But by 1972, the residents had adapted. They wore heavy coats in the winter and embraced the elements. The skystreets proved that humans don't need to be hidden in dark corridors. We are social animals. We want to be seen. We want to be part of a hive. Habitat 67 was the perfect hive. Chapter 8, The 1970s Political Backdrop, a Symbol of New Canada. 1972 was a pivotal year for Canada, and Habitat 67 was at the center of the national identity. The country was changing. It was moving away from its British colonial past. It wanted to be seen as a modern, bilingual, and multicultural leader. Montreal was the crown jewel of this new Canada. The finalization of Habitat 67 in 1972 coincided with the lead-up to the 1976 Montreal Olympics. The city was under construction everywhere. New subways were being dug. Huge skyscrapers were rising. In this political climate, Habitat 67 was a symbol of Canadian ambition. It was a message to the world: we are not just a land of snow and trees. We are a land of the future. The building became a backdrop for every visiting dignitary. Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau, a man of style and intellect, often used the building as a symbol of Canadian innovation. It represented the just society he wanted to build. It was radical, it was intellectual, and it was bold. However, there was tension. In 1972, the Quebec sovereignty movement was growing. Montreal was a place of political fire. Habitat 67 sat on the water, a quiet fortress amidst the storm. Some saw it as a federalist vanity project. Others saw it as a global masterpiece that transcended local politics. The 1972 finalization was a statement of stability. While the rest of the world was dealing with the oil crisis and the Vietnam War, Canada was finishing a utopia. It gave the people of Montreal a sense of pride. Even if you couldn't afford to live there, you could look at it and feel that your city was special. It was the Eiffel Tower of concrete. By 1972, it was clear that Habitat 67 was no longer just a building. It was a political monument. It was the face of a nation that was brave enough to build the impossible. Chapter 9, The Media's Verdict, The World Watches 1972. By the time the final dust settled in 1972, the global media had been tracking Habitat 67 for 5 long years. But 1972 was the year of the final verdict. During the Expo 67 years, the press was blinded by the spectacle. They wrote about the glamour and the novelty. But in 1972, the architectural critics returned with sharper pens. They wanted to know, is this a real building or just a high-priced stage set? The New York Times published influential reviews that shaped the building's global reputation. Some critics were breathless with praise. They called it the most significant residential structure of the 20th century. They marveled at how Safdie had managed to keep the project alive when so many other experimental buildings were being demolished. They noted that in an era of boring, flat-topped skyscrapers, Habitat 67 was a mountain of hope. It represented a break from the international style that was making every city in the world look exactly the same. However, the local Montreal press was often more cynical. In 1972, newspapers focused heavily on the million-dollar boxes. They published detailed reports on the government's spending. They interviewed taxpayers who were angry that so much money had been spent on so few people. They called it the concrete ghetto for the rich. This media tension created a fascinating duality. To the world, it was an icon of genius. To the local taxpayer in 1972, it was a symbol of government excess. Architectural journals of the time took a more technical approach. They debated the modular myth. They argued that because Safdie had failed to build 1,000 units, the experiment was technically a failure in terms of mass production. They claimed that prefabrication was supposed to make housing cheaper, not more expensive. This was a heated debate in 1972. The media was essentially deciding the future of the construction industry. If Habitat 67 was too expensive, would anyone ever try it again? Despite the criticism, the visual power of the building won the war. In 1972, it began appearing in fashion magazines, movies, and advertisements. It was the ultimate cool backdrop. The media helped turn the building into a brand. Even if the economics were wrong, the aesthetic was right. The 1972 verdict was clear: Habitat 67 might be a financial disaster, but it was an artistic triumph. It became the most photographed building in Canada. This media coverage ensured that even if no more boxes were added, the building would live forever in the global imagination. It was the moment the project moved from the business section of the paper to the arts and cultures section. Chapter 10: The Maintenance Legend, The Pioneers of Concrete. Living in a landmark is not a passive experience. By 1972, the first wave of permanent residents had settled in, and they quickly realized they were more than just tenants, they were curators. The finalization of the building meant the government was slowly pulling back its daily support. The residents had to take over. This created what we called a maintenance legend. Imagine the technical knowledge required to live there in 1972. You couldn't just call a regular plumber or a local handyman. Everything in your home was custom. If a window seal broke, it was a geometric puzzle to fix. If the irrigation in your sky garden clogged, it could flood the neighbor below you. The residents of 1972 had to form an elite cooperative spirit. They shared tips on how to manage the specialized fiberglass bathrooms. They learned how to track the breadth of the concrete. The 1972 finalization forced the creation of a user manual for the building. This wasn't a standard book, it was a living document. It covered everything from how to protect the private terraces during a blizzard to how to clean the beton brute without causing erosion. The residents became amateur engineers. They were deeply invested in the building's health. Because they owned a piece of a dream, they were willing to put in the work that a normal apartment dweller would never consider. There was also the psychological aspect of maintenance. In 1972, living in Habitat was a full-time job of defending the vision. Residents would often find tourists wandering the streets in the sky or looking into their windows. The privacy Safdie had promised was being challenged by the building's own fame. The 1972 residents had to balance being exhibits with being human beings. The gardens were the biggest challenge. By 1972, the irrigation systems finalized during the construction were being tested by real plants and real soil. Keeping a garden alive 10 stories in the air, exposed to the river winds, required a specific type of grit. The residents who stayed were the ones who loved the challenge. They were the ones who saw the value in the vertical village. The maintenance legend of 1972 is a story of how architecture only survives if the people inside it are willing to fight for it. It proved that a building is not just made of concrete, it is made of the care provided by its inhabitants. Chapter 11: Safdie's Reflection, 1972 versus 1964. In 1972, Moshe Safdie was no longer the 23-year-old student who had dreamed up a thesis. He was now 34 years old, an international celebrity, and a man who had seen his utopia collide with the real world. His reflection in 1972 is one of the most poignant parts of this story. He stood in the Finalized complex and saw two different things: a massive victory and a heartbreaking compromise. Comparing 1964 to 1972 is like comparing a poem to a legal contract. In 1964, everything was possible. Safdie's model showed thousands of boxes. He saw a world where every city would have a habitat. He believed his system would end the housing crisis. He believed in the industrialization of the home. In his mind, Habitat 67 was just the seed. But by 1972, as the last crane left the site, he had to face the reality that the seed would not grow any further. The 1972 finalization was, in many ways, the death of his original system, even as it was the birth of his most famous landmark. Safdie reflected on the political battles he had lost. He thought about the 800 units that were never built. He felt the weight of the luxury label that was now attached to his name. He didn't want to be an architect for the 1%, he wanted to be an architect for the 100%. However, Safdie also found peace in the finalized structure. He saw the streets and the sky working exactly as he had planned. He saw neighbors talking. He saw the trees on the terraces surviving the winter. He realized that even if he hadn't changed the entire world, he had changed the world for these 158 families. He had proved that his fractal geometry was not a fantasy, it was a functioning, breathing home. In 1972, Safdie began to move his focus to other parts of the world. He took the lessons of Montreal to Israel, to Singapore, and to the United States. He learned that to build the future, you have to be a politician, an economist, and a psychologist, not just an architect. His 1972 reflection was a coming-of-age moment. He stopped being a visionary student and became a master architect. He realized that Habitat 67 was not a failed prototype, but a successful monument. It was the anchor for his entire career. 1972 was the year he accepted that his masterpiece was finished, even if it wasn't complete. Chapter 12, The Global Shadow of 1972, The DNA of Modernity. The 1972 finalization of Habitat 67 cast a shadow that reached across the entire planet. Even though the Canadian government decided it was too expensive to replicate, other nations were watching. 1972 was the year the Habitat DNA began to mutate and appear in other forms. It was the year the box became a global language. In Japan, the metabolism movement was in full swing. Architects like Kisho Kurokawa were looking at Habitat 67 as their primary inspiration. They saw Safdie's 1972 success as proof that capsule living was possible. The Nakajin Capsule Tower in Tokyo owes its existence to the path cleared by Habitat 67. The idea of the modular unit was now a legitimate branch of architecture. In the decades that followed 1972, we saw the rise of the terraced city. In every corner of the world, from the hills of Haifa to the luxury towers of Singapore, the concept of stepped architecture became a way to provide light and air in dense environments. Safdie's fractal approach influenced a whole generation of architects who were tired of the glassbox skyscraper. 1972 also marked a shift in how we think about social housing. Even if Habitat became expensive, the intent was studied by urban planners everywhere. The 1972 finalization proved that high density didn't have to mean high misery. It proved that you could stack houses and still give people a sense of dignity and ownership. This humanized density is the core of modern urban planning in the 21st century. When you look at modern vertical forests today, like those in Milan or Shenzhen, you are looking at the 1972 finalization of Habitat 67. The idea of putting a forest on a skyscraper was considered insane until Safdie proved it worked in 1972. The global shadow is not just about the buildings that look like Habitat, it's about the buildings that think like Habitat. It's about the shift from shelter to environment. 1972 was the year the world realized that architecture could be a mountain, a village, and a machine all at once. The DNA of that year is now embedded in the skyline of every major city on Earth. Chapter 13, The Eternal Brutalist Icon, Conclusion. As we conclude this journey on Synapse Daily, we return to the quiet pier in Montreal. It is 1972. The sun is setting over the St. Lawrence River. The concrete boxes of Habitat 67 are glowing in the late afternoon light. The construction crews are gone. The political debates have faded into the background. What remains is a miracle of geometry and guts. The 1972 finalization was not just the end of a construction project. It was the birth of a legend. Habitat 67 stands today as a National Heritage Site, but more importantly, it stands as a living neighborhood. It is one of the few experimental buildings from the 1960s that didn't just survive, it thrived. It is now more popular, more expensive, and more respected than it was on the day it was finished. We look back at 1972 as a year of brave completion. It was a year when Canada said, "We will finish what we started." It was a year that proved that even if a dream is expensive, even if it is difficult, and even if it is imperfect, it is still worth doing. Habitat 67 is a reminder that our cities don't have to be flat. Our lives don't have to be lived in dark corridors. We can reach for the light. We can have our garden in the sky. Moshe Safdie's concrete mountain is a testament to the human spirit's desire to reinvent itself. It challenges the grid. It challenges the box. It reminds us that architecture is the stage upon which we play out our highest ambitions. In 1972, the stage was set. And for over 50 years, the play has continued. The vertical village remains a beacon for every student, every dreamer, and every citizen who believes that a home should be more than just four walls. It should be a piece of the sky. This has been Synapse Daily. Like this video, comment your thoughts below, subscribe for more fascinating stories.